Sectionalism. So this video is going to include that section of your book that's Senate bloodshed, and so everything after that won't be until the final exam. So, Stephen A. Douglas, remember, the supreme nationalist, very much wanted to connect the East and the West together and understood that a transcontinental railroad would do just that. It wouldn't just be a physical link between the East and the West, but an ideological link as well. And the idea that, Americans could spread democracy across the United States with a railroad. Now, the route that he had in mind would have gone from Chicago through Nebraska territory. Of course, Native Americans lived in this region, but once again, and not for the last time, the federal government would basically respond by reneging on earlier promises to the Native Americans and forcing them to move. So now all that was needed was that Douglas needed congressional approval to establish governments for this Nebraska territory so he could have his railroad. And so this is going to mean that Douglas will put forward the KansasNebraska Act. This bill will split Nebraska territory into two, one being Kansas and one being Nebraska, with the understanding that then they would each choose to be either a slave state or a free state, thus popular sovereignty. But the reality of the situation, or the idea really, was that Kansas most likely would vote to be a slave state, whereas Nebraska would choose to be free. There's one big problem with this, though. This act essentially would be repealing the Missouri Compromise, because you can see that Kansas territory right there would be actually north of the line that said nothing north of this would have slavery. And so Northerners were outraged by this. They saw this once again as the South's unquenchable desire to spread slavery and expand its political power. This starts meaning that the debate is transformed into, good against evil, liberty versus oppression. However, Pierce will back up this bill, and with the support of enough Northern Democrats, the KansasNebraska Act will have victory and become law. But this is going to lead to bleeding Kansas. The thing is, Kansas really was the most likely of all the territories to support slavery. This is due to a few different factors. First of all, it had a very fertile soil. It also had a very favorable climate, long growing season and everything, and its location adjacent right next to the slave state of Missouri. And so because of this, basically Southerners as well as anti-slavery Northerners are both going to begin this really intensive drive to recruit as many settlers as possible to try to establish a majority in Kansas. In March of 1855, pro-slavery forces in Kansas, relying on ineligible votes of Missouri residents, will fraudulently elect a territorial legislature that would promptly pass a series of measures that were extremely harsh, like a law mandating the death penalty for aiding a fugitive slave. Another law made it like a felony to even question slaveholding in Kansas. And the pro-slavery majority would also go on to expel the few free staters that had been elected to their assembly. Now, free staters, basically in response, would try to establish their own government in Topeka, and they vowed to make Kansas white. So keep in mind here, the free staters aren't necessarily anti-slavery as much as they are really anti-black. So because of this, we basically have a civil war erupting in Kansas, a miniature civil war. This is going to climax by the spring of 1856. This conflict that occurs is known as Bleeding Kansas. It would include things like a group of pro-slavery officials at one point attacked the Free State stronghold of Lawrence. They subjected the town to a heavy artillery barrage. Nobody was killed, though the town did have extensive damage. However, reports of these pro-slavery forces attacking Lawrence were then exaggerated in Eastern newspapers. And as a reaction, 3 days later, John Brown, an abolitionist from Connecticut, actually went with several different sympathizers to just south of Lawrence looking for pro-slavery settlers, and they would literally kill 5 pro-slavery men there. So that was Bleeding Kansas. Now, 5 days before the sack of Lawrence, we're also going to see violence literally on the floor of the Senate. Well, not actually 5 days before. So 5 days before, what happens is Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner delivers this long-winded diatribe on the Senate floor, and it was full of a lot of personal insults against several different Southern congressmen, including South Carolina Senator Andrew P. Butler. So Sumner is insulting Butler on the Senate floor. 2 days after that, so now we're 3 days before the sack of Lawrence, Butler's cousin, Preston Brooks, is basically going to try to defend his cousin's honor. And so Brooks would enter the mostly vacant Senate chamber where Sumner was working on a speech, and then he raised his walking cane and beat Sumner over the head of it. So this is happening in the Senate. Sumner does recover from his injuries, but he doesn't return to the Senate for about 3 years. And his empty chair on the Senate floor really would offer the Southerners mute confirmation that Southerners are becoming more and more despotic. And meanwhile, Southerners would shower Brooks with new walking canes. So, as a part of your journal, I ask you this question. What is the importance of this event? Why must we remember it? I asked this pretty vague so that you could talk about either the whole Charles Sumner, Brooks, and Butler conflict, or if you want to talk about Bleeding Kansas instead. Any part of this video, like why do we need to remember these? Which brings us to new political parties. So we're definitely seeing the North and the South become a lot more polarized, a lot more antagonistic towards each other, and definitely seeing a widening of sectional divisions. And we're going to see this in the political parties as well. So from 1854 through 56, we're going to see a lot of Northerners especially trying to move into new political parties. And this is going to kind of alter the political landscape and really sharpen some of the sectional conflict as well. So slavery was the main issue that was responsible for a lot of this party realignment, but you have to keep in mind other issues are going to cause this as well. Things like we have a ton of immigrants coming to the United States between 1848 and 60, and a lot of them, for instance, are a lot of Irish Roman Catholics. And here, a lot of these immigrants would compete for jobs with native-born Protestant workers, and a lot of times they would work for lower wages, and this kind of job competition bred animosity towards immigrants, and even violence towards immigrants. And a lot of Protestant Americans were really concerned about, these immigrants' Catholicism as well, and they thought of them as immoral, whereas, a lot of immigrants coming in, especially the Irish, made it clear that they had very little use for Protestant reform, including things like temperance or abolitionism. And so we're going to get new parties emerging because of this strife between native-born Americans and immigrants, such as the Know Nothing Party, Literally, the Know Nothing Party began as a secret organization. When asked about the party, they would say, I know nothing. This was, more than anything else, an anti-immigrant party, and it had been formed in the wreckage of the Whig Party starting in about 1854. The Know Nothing Party really did surprisingly well in local and congressional elections in the fall of 1854. They did achieve some notable reforms in areas such as they supported public health and public education programs in Massachusetts. However, as much as they had this reform agenda, what was really the most important thing for them was their anti-Catholicism. The problem with that is ethnic and religious bigotry are weak links to hold together a national party. And so the Know Nothing Party would eventually fall to quarreling over slavery in particular. Northern Know Nothings a lot of times would find a new home in the new Republican Party that was also formed in 1854, mostly from anti-slavery Whigs and Democrats who were really disgusted with Pierce's administration's Kansas policy. A lot of this new Republican Party wanted a strong state and federal government to promote like economic and social reforms, and they very much opposed slavery in the territories. So in this way, the Republican Party is kind of setting itself up to be seen as really the anti-Southern sectional party as well. Fun fact here, if you look at this flag, this is a Know Nothing Party flag, and you'll notice that some of the ends are backwards. One of my students, I think actually just last fall, asked me about this, and when I looked it up, it's basically the equivalent of, you know, when people talk on the internet and they'll make fun of someone for saying something stupid by doing like random capital letters throughout, and so that script. The idea was that this was supposed to be showing that, oh, foreigners wouldn't know how to do like proper English.